Hello and welcome to the latest Fellside midweek reflection. On this one, I've just got one verse of the Bible to share with you, and I will do that first before moving on to explain what I'm going to do in this reflection. So the verse is from Matthew chapter 7, beginning at verse 12, one that I think we'll be very much aware of indeed. Jesus said, this is part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "In everything do to others as you would have them do to you, for this is the law and the prophets." And of course that's become known over the years as the Golden Rule. And I thought of that with regard to a story that I came across, and this story that I'm about to share with you now really challenged me and made me think. It is a story that I've come across before. I may even have used it in one of my sermons before. But as I came across this and reread it, there was a real challenge there for me as well. And I did come across an explanation of this story as well, and an interpretation that could be put upon it. So I'm going to be really honest and say that there's not much of myself in what I say after I've told you this story. But it was on reading the explanation, or one of the possible explanations that could be put on this story, that really challenged me with regard to attitude and how others see us and so on. And it did bring to mind that verse of Jesus that I've just read from the Sermon on the Mount, commonly known as the Golden Rule. But anyway, on with the story. And this story took place in the early 1900s. And it was a German man named von Osten. And apparently Van Osten trained his horse, which was called Hans. He actually trained his horse to count by tapping his front hoof. And apparently Hans, the horse, was a quick learner, because Van Osten soon had him performing amazing feats in front of paying audiences. And Hans, the horse, demonstrated a talent for adding, subtracting, dividing, and performing mathematical calculations. He was even able to count the number of people in a room, or the number of people who were wearing glasses. And as his fame grew, he became known as Clever Hans, the smartest horse in the world. But there were doubters, not surprisingly. There were doubters. And some accused von Osten of deceiving the public by using trickery and sleight of hand to make money. They demanded proof of the horse's mathematical abilities. And the first test that the doubters came up with involved calculating numbers that were randomly selected on stage by people other than his owner. And using his hoof, Hans pounded out the correct answers every time. And some of the doubters started to believe that the horse was indeed a mathematical genius. Then came the second test. In this one person whispered a number in the horse's left ear, and another person whispered a number in his right ear. And then the horse was told to add the two numbers and pound out the sum. And he couldn't do it. And on further investigation, it was found that Hans could solve problems only if someone he could see knew the answer. And when Hans was given numbers and asked to compute them, well, spectators, they leaned forward and they tensed their bodies as Hans began tapping his hoof. And when the horse had tapped the correct number, onlookers relaxed their body postures and nodded their heads, which was the horse's signal to stop tapping. So Hans was indeed clever, not because he could calculate, not because he could do sums, but because he could read human body language. And this clever horse could figure out the correct answers to mathematical equations simply by watching the people around him. And the explanation of that story, or a possible interpretation that could be put on that story that I came across, is very, very challenging indeed. And it's this: if someone were watching you that closely, what would they discover? What would they discover from your body language? Obviously, Hans the horse could work out a lot of things from people's body language. But that challenge, that interpretation that I came across on that story, simply this: if someone were watching you that closely, what would they discover? What would they discover about me? And specifically, and this is the real challenge, what would they discover about you and me following Jesus? What would they discover about you and me following Jesus? The thing is that we don't have to say a word about following Jesus to let people know what kind of difference he's made in our life. All we have to do is live. And as St. Francis of Assisi once famously said, preach the gospel at all times, if necessary, use words. And so our actions, body language, our non-verbal communication often do the talking for us. And when our actions contradict our words, our actions win out every time. And the question has been asked, and this is what I found really challenging in the interpretation that I came across. The question has been asked: if you were arrested for being a follower of Jesus, would there be enough evidence to convict you? I'll say that again. The question has been asked: if you were arrested for being a follower of Jesus, would there be enough evidence to convict you? Wow, what a challenge that is. And when I read that, it almost literally stopped me in my tracks. Would there be enough evidence to convict you? And I began to think of my own actions, my own words, and the like, and to think about the simple things that we do each and every day as we are with other people, as we meet other people. And how do I speak to the girl on the checkout in the supermarket? And especially in these days as we continue with lockdown. And you don't need me to tell you that supermarket workers have been on the front line, as it were, all during this pandemic and these lockdowns. And we know it's not always easy to keep your patience and so on in a supermarket, because many a time people simply don't socially distance. And, that happened to me recently. I was looking at something on a shelf. I took a little step back and walked straight into a woman who was oblivious of the distancing rules and was just there far too close. And how do we react in situations like that? How do we deal with it? What do our actions say to others of us and our witness to Jesus? And, it's possible, isn't it, to get impatient in these days of lockdown and restrictions. And sometimes that can be a real challenge to me. If you was to ask Deborah, she'd say that was something that I needed to work on. And, all those things, and you can think of illustrations that would fit yourself and this description. How do I speak to the person in the petrol station? How do I react with them and liaise with them in these days? How do I answer the phone when I'm in the middle of something and the phone interrupts me? What's my tone of voice? What is it that comes across to the person on the other end of the phone? And I was really challenged and moved by the interpretation of that story, and I'm just quite simply, honestly, sharing that with you in this recording. And I think there's a challenge there for each and every one of us listening to these words of our actions, our reactions. How do they speak of our faith, of our witness to the Lord Jesus Christ? And as I said earlier in that reflection of some of the words from the interpretation on that story, you don't have to say a word about following Jesus to let people know what kind of difference he's made in your life. And by the way, you may be wondering what my reaction was to that lady who I backed into. I quite simply smiled and said nothing. That was the best way to deal with it. So I did think I dealt with that okay and wasn't a bad witness in that situation. But it's those little things that very often catch us out and cause people to say, well, and he calls himself a Christian, or she calls herself a Christian. So I think some very challenging words that can go to that story. You know, the horse was clever. He could read people's body language. So what does our body language, what does that say to other people about our witness? What do they see when they look at us? What does our body language say about our faith in the Lord Jesus Christ? And that's a challenge to me just as much as it will be to you. So a simple little story on the face of it, this German man way back in the early 1900s training his horse to do certain things, and all these years later, what a great lesson that can be to us in so many ways. And so that closes the midweek reflection. So as always, until the next time, which will be this coming weekend, as I lead a simple Fellside service for us. So until a few days' time, bye for now.